Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into a really fascinating breakdown of a piece of political and economic media. Today, we're taking a highly focused, totally objective look at a specific television broadcast. We're looking at a segment from Laura Ingraham's program, The Angle, which delivers a really sharp critique of the modern socialist movement in America. Now, our goal here today isn't to take a side. We are just going to thoroughly unpack the arguments, the rhetoric, and specifically the economic and political impacts that are outlined in this segment. Let's see exactly how this broadcast builds its case.
Right out of the gate, this broadcast pulls zero punches. It kicks off with this incredibly dramatic hook. I call it the socialist stampede. Ingraham uses this phrase to immediately set the stage for what she's presenting as an urgent, sweeping political movement. She throws out a hypothetical scenario that, honestly, might have seemed completely unthinkable a few years ago, but she suggests is now a real possibility. She's talking about Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez potentially running as the Democratic presidential nominee in 2028, facing off against Republican figures like J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio.
So you kind of have to wonder, why bring up a hypothetical 2028 election matchup years in advance? Is that a realistic possibility or just a rhetorical device to grab attention? Well, as we break down the source material, it becomes pretty clear that the broadcast uses this matchup to immediately crank up the stakes for its audience. By placing a self-identified democratic socialist at the very top of a future presidential ticket, the segment anchors its upcoming economic critiques not just as some abstract theoretical debate, but as imminent national realities that could absolutely impact your wallet.
Moving into Section 1, the TikTok socialist persona.
Let's look at how the broadcast actually characterizes these political figures. They coined this term, the TikTok socialist. Ingraham specifically critiques AOC for essentially playing two contrasting roles at the exact same time. On one hand, you have the earnest, pull-yourself-up-by-your-bootstraps grassroots activist who is out there trying to stick it to the establishment. But on the other hand, she really leans into the aesthetic of a relatable, girly girl sharing her favorite cooking recipes on platforms like Instagram and TikTok. The broadcast argues that this creates this massive surface appeal that is perfectly tailored for a mindset that rarely strays beyond 120-character messaging.
And to back up this critique, the segment rolls the tape. They show a series of specific clips to argue that when these influencers step outside their social media comfort zones and face serious questioning, they stumble hard. The broadcast highlights moments where AOC gave super vague or unsure answers regarding complex geopolitics, things like the occupation of Palestine or U.S. foreign policy when it comes to defending Taiwan. The show even points to what it calls climate alarmism, highlighting that famous claim that the world is going to end in 12 years if climate change isn't addressed, which the host kind of mocks, saying, I guess that means it all ends in 2031. The core argument here is that the aesthetic appeal masks a profound lack of depth.
That takes us to Section 2, Capitalism and Contrasting Histories.
This brings us right to the ideological clash at the heart of the segment. The broadcast doesn't just go after the messaging, it goes after the underlying worldview regarding America's economic foundations. The segment plays a clip of AOC asserting that when this country started, it absolutely did not operate on a capitalist economy. Well, Ingraham forcefully rebuts this on screen. She argues that while the early 1700s United States was an agrarian-based market economy, it naturally evolved with the industrial age into broader market-based capitalism. This side-by-side comparison is used by the broadcast to argue that modern socialists are actively trying to stoke a distrust of capitalism by rewriting its history.
Next up is Section 3, Prioritizing Feelings over Facts.
The broadcast attempts to explain exactly why this movement is gaining traction despite the critiques we just covered. And their answer? Emotion. To support this, the broadcast features this wild street interview. They speak with a young woman who the host assumes is a college graduate, and she explicitly defends the ideology of Karl Marx. When they ask her why, her response is incredibly revealing for the segment's overall thesis. She says she bases her idealism on it because it, quote, sounds like the perfect world to me personally, and she feels like it would be just so much better. The broadcast uses this to highlight a reliance on how an ideology feels rather than how it actually functions.
So, where does the broadcast say this feeling over thinking dynamic comes from? They point the finger squarely at the modern education system. Ingraham makes the case that millennials and Gen Z have basically been trained in classrooms to validate their feelings over engaging in critical thinking based on historical and economic facts. She links this mindset to broader cultural demands, suggesting that just as students are taught to demand respect for pronouns based on how they feel, they similarly feel that wealth inequality is wrong without actually analyzing the economic realities behind it.
Which brings us to Section 4, the economic impact of socialism. This is the real core of today's Explainer. Let's unpack the actual economic consequences exactly as they are presented in the source material. The segment zeroes in on rhetoric from Senator Bernie Sanders to illustrate the foundational socialist grievance with wealth. They play a clip of Sanders condemning an economic system where the very richest people are getting richer. Ingraham points out that this emotional reaction, the feeling that innovators like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos simply make too much money, is what drives the entire economic policy of this movement.
And here is where Ingraham issues a massive economic warning. According to this segment, because the socialist mindset is based on grievance rather than actual economics, their only real answer is the relentless punishment of innovators. The broadcast argues this approach never achieves anything positive. It literally only results in stifling economic growth and choking off opportunity for everybody else. The most striking claim here is that modern socialists aren't actually interested in economic growth at all.
Actually, they take it a step further. It's a pretty radical claim. The broadcast argues that the socialist vision actively desires a lower standard of living for most Americans. The host summarizes the movement's core message as, "You all consume too much. You should be happy with less." The segment argues that under the guise of saving the planet and fighting climate change, the actual economic impact they are pushing for is a society with way less prosperity and far fewer choices. Finally, Section 5, Motives and Political Power. If the intended economic impact is actually a lower standard of living, why push for it? What is the true endgame here? To illustrate this, the broadcast highlights Wisconsin politician Francesca Hong as a prime example of this dual-role concept we talked about earlier. The segment notes how the media just gushes over Hong's harmless, relatable aesthetic. You know, she wears friendship bracelets, she does karaoke, but the broadcast sharply contrasts those harmless vibes with her extreme political actions, specifically her push to defund the police as a first step toward abolishing them entirely.
So, what is the big takeaway from Ingraham's perspective? The broadcast concludes that these figures are not just misguided on economics. According to the segment, their ultimate goal was gaining political power by any means necessary. Even if it requires willingly creating chaos in the process, the segment closes with a very stark declaration that these socialists for the vibes actually hate the country, that socialism is inherently anti-American at its core, and therefore the fact that these policies would be bad for most Americans isn't a bug in their plan, it's a feature.
And that leaves us with a huge question, drawn straight from the broadcast thesis. We've looked at how this segment frames the aesthetic appeal, the reliance on emotion, and the stark warnings of a lowered standard of living. The source material is essentially asking its audience to decide, is this movement simply a push for environmental balance and fairness, or is it, as the broadcast argues, a chaotic, anti-American pursuit of power? It's a heavy question, and one that requires looking way past a 120-character social media post to truly understand the arguments at play. Thank you so much for joining me as we broke down this fascinating material. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time on The Explainer.